We're driven by the search for better. But when it comes to hiring, the best way to search for a candidate isn't to search at all. Don't search, match with Indeed. Indeed is your matching and hiring platform with over 350 million global monthly visitors, according to Indeed data, and a matching engine that helps you find quality candidates fast. Leveraging over 140 million qualifications and preferences every day, Indeed's matching engine is constantly learning from your preferences. Join more than 3.5 million businesses worldwide that use Indeed to hire great talent fast. And listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/Blue Wire. Just go to Indeed.com/Blue Wire right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Indeed.com/Blue Wire. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed.
Every time I see the replay of it, I'm expecting it to like hit the screen, hit a wire. I'm expecting it not to, be able to travel because it is thrown at such a trajectory.
It's December 2015, Packers at Lions. This is Remember That Game, the podcast about sporting events that take you on a journey and maybe chart the path of the zeitgeist. I'm your host, Thomas Emerick, and my guest here for the show's network launch is the executive producer of RotoViz Radio Podcast Network and host of RotoViz Overtime, Colm Kelly. I'm thrilled to bring Remember That Game to the RotoViz airways. How are you feeling as we lace up and get ready for Thursday Night Football for your Packers in Detroit?
I'm excited. I cannot wait for this. This was a game you asked which game, and there's some games that are Super Bowl wins, different things like that, playoff wins, but this is a game that really has stuck in my mind. We'll talk about the reasons why that is. There's sentimental reasons. There's the play that finished this game off and much, much more. So I'm excited for all that, but I'm also excited to have the podcast on the RotoViz network. I'm excited to see where it goes and grows over the next couple of months and hopefully over the next years. So I am going to urge anyone listening that is listening on RotoViz Radio is where you're going to be listening to this. You'll also be able to hear it on its own individual podcast feed. Make sure you subscribe, come back and hear each and every episode. You can go back as well. There is a catalog of these episodes from people from all around the fantasy space and not just fantasy, but I guess the football space to talk through their favorite moments, their favorite games, and some of the names in there I'm sure you'll be looking to dive in and listen to. So check all that out. But Thomas, let's do this and welcome to RotoViz.
Yeah, great to be here. And I think this is a great fit. Like, say, Julius Peppers joining the Packers, who ends up making a huge play in this one. I went back for that edition because there were really no notable outside signings in 2015, as was generally Ted Thompson's way. Packers running it back with their guys and their draft picks. And they were perennial Super Bowl contenders doing it, with weird things kind of getting in their way, like onside kicks or the Niner offense. Well, it's winter 2015, and Capers versus Harbaugh in the playoffs is an impossibility. Things are probably a little better sorted out on the hands team this year. Many know this one as the Rodgers Hail Mary game in Detroit. What made this Week 13 game from the very start such an emotionally involved game for you as a Packers fan?
I've got to say a few things here. You almost like started this off with, one of those kind of sandwiches where it's like it's starting off positive. Let's talk about some of the bad stuff that happened for many years with the Packers, and then let's sweeten it up here as we get to the end. But you mentioned the 49ers. When you mentioned that, that was gone from my mind. The flashbacks to Colin Kaepernick just galloping through the Packers defense is the stuff that I feared. We had the playoff game as well where Kaepernick comes to Lambeau. We're talking about the cold. The 49ers aren't going to like the cold. He comes out with no sleeves on. He's ready to roll, and they tear it up again. The Seahawks game, if we had to talk about which game is the most painful, I think, in my entire Packers fandom, is the Seahawks NFC Championship game. When you mentioned onside kicks, that was, I think, what you were referencing there. That is the stuff of nightmares. And 2 years ago, we had the 49ers come in and they cleaned us out again in a situation. And that was really painful because it was a shocking loss because we kind of weren't expecting it. The Packers were on a bit of a roll there. But this game in particular, to set the scene, I lived in Melbourne, Australia for a period of time with my wife. She was then my fiance at that time. And we had like this one-bedroom apartment where it had the bedroom, then obviously everything else, but it was pretty much in the it was really one room that was turned into an apartment with a kitchen and everything like this. So she's sitting at this paper thin sliding door wall that's at the opposite side when this game takes place, because I want to set the scene, because obviously when this final play happens, there is some activity from me who is watching at the opposite side of that wall, and it may have frightened her a little bit. So yeah, the scene here is, you mentioned the Packers and how they went about things. Free agency wasn't something until very, very recently that they did attack, and Peppers was somebody who, obviously, Chicago Bears legend. I don't know if he still is in that mode since he went to the Packers and had a nice little run with Green Bay as well, but just a freak of a player. So they had started to add some players in, and as we go through this game, some of the names we talk about, people will be kind of probably wondering, how was this team in contention for playoffs year in, year out? But it managed it, and the main reason for that is one Aaron Rodgers.
Yeah, I mean, get in here. You'll notice there's going to be no Jordy Nelson. Packers have the back-to-back of that NFC title loss on an onside kick and a punter throwing a pass into the end zone that is caught by a Seahawks player somehow. And just various things like that conspire to knock the Packers out of a Super Bowl bid there. And then second week of the preseason, the following August, Jordy Nelson's out
on a routine play, which did not look like it was going to be a season ender.
The knee injuries that seem like nothing, sometimes so brutal there. And for the Packers, seemingly brutal until the year starts, 6-0. But to build up some of this drama and the angst here, maybe for Packers fans, I wonder, they dropped 3 of 4 heading into Detroit. They're sliding a bit. Detroit had beaten the Packers in Lambeau 3 weeks earlier, on the verge of the first sweep of the Packers since 1991 at that point. Did the 2015 and 2016 teams feel different than the previous 5 campaigns?
Don't necessarily think, obviously the years that they won the Super Bowl, a young team getting to that point, maybe not expected heading into the season. Then there was an expectation around the Packers team, making the playoffs and trying to make those deep runs. And that was, again, a lot of it associated around Aaron Rodgers. I think it was a team at that point where it was overachieving year on year. I think when we look at what they did then prior to his last 2 MVPs, that was a team that was kind of, and probably with those MVPs and not making it back to a Super Bowl, they were teams that were underachieving. I think they were a lot more rounded rosters. I think these rosters, there was a lot of question marks, a lot of holes. And again, Rodgers was pretty much a plaster to put out over all that elevated the entire roster. When we look through some of the names, as we move through the likes of a James Starks, Eddie Lacy, at that time, there was 2 positive seasons prior to this. But, Devontae Adams was in the slump of his career. I'm sure we'll talk about that. We have Jeff Janis. I'm sure we're going to talk about him, who had no impact on this game. But then we have like Aberderis, James Jones was back at this time. Like just Randall Cobb. I guess we'll say Randall Cobb at that point was in his prime, but, it was still on the wane. So I don't think this roster was, as good as maybe a 6-0 start, but the concerns that were really starting to ramp up, as you mentioned, 6-0 at this point then with those games lost and having lost to the Lions. And I'm sure we're going to get into how the game progressed, but in this one, they fall behind 20-0. They're 17-0 down at halftime. So there's a lot of things at that point as a Packers fan. You mentioned like as the angst building at that point, that really feels at halftime like your season is slipping away in a major way. And obviously 1 game less than we have now in these seasons. So every single game even mattered that little bit more, I think. So, yeah. On the defensive side, though, we did have some players who were able to make plays, but there was, I think, playmakers, but not an overall defense. Again, like maybe we've seen in recent years, Clinton Dix was kind of rounding in. Sam Shields was there. Peppers, who you mentioned. Clay Matthews is there. But just a lot of other parts that maybe were letting plays happen rather than making plays.
Packers nearly come away with a pick on the first drive on Stafford, but they let that one slip away. 17-0 at halftime. Come on, really? The Lions having won 3 straight, and they were at this point 3 games back with 5 left. But were you fearing the Lions breathing down your neck?
Big time. And especially as the game progressed. And the way this game played out is, I mentioned I was in Australia. The time difference obviously makes a factor in when these games take place, but I can't remember specifically. I think I watched this game on delay. So what I used to do when I was in Australia is I would go to work, and when I come back, the game, like I would not, no phone coverage, no looking at, and obviously back then as well, Twitter isn't as big of an issue. There's not a lot of ways to find out when you're in Australia in 2015, 2016 as to what the results are going to be. So with Game Pass then, and watch it as if it's live, but it is obviously on delay. So I think when it was at that point, and as a fan, you mightn't want to admit this, but when you're 20 to zip down, there's a lot of those plays where you're like trying to skip that 10 seconds forward to see how we're getting, like, are we getting back here? I don't want to waste my time watching the slip away. But yeah, thankfully, as the game wore on, they did get back into it. And I want to highlight something here. We didn't mention this at the start, and I didn't realize this until this week. This game actually has its own title as to how it finished up. It is.
Yeah, they try to brand it
The Miracle in Motown.
Yeah, they try to
Are you buying into that? No.
I had that originally in the intro. I was like, does anyone say that?
Nobody's going to know what that is. But that is what it's on Wikipedia. It's under the Miracle in Motown. That's how I realized it.
Branding opportunity that didn't quite work out. Yeah, I always hear just the Rodgers Hail Mary game or the first one, as we'll touch on later. We're
going to talk about that later. Yeah. The first one in a kind of 6-week period.
Yeah, which is so wild. The Lions get to that 20-0 lead. It starts with they get a field goal after Packers drop a pick. And then Lions go up 10-0 on a drive where Amir Abdullah rips off a big chunk by shaking Morgan Burnett in the open field. A flashy play like the ones Abdullah made that preseason, vaulting him to 4th among rookies in MFL average draft position and overall 5th-round ADP. Some might say a late riser. By his second year, that had dropped to more around the 7-8 round turn. Do you recall buying into the Amir Abdullah hype or any other players back in the day who made some exciting plays in the preseason? And what are your thoughts on when the needle moves in part because of rookie preseason clips?
I think now with the circulation, like if you think back to this time when things were happening, I'm sure there was people, putting clips up on social media, but it wasn't as easy to, have your smartphone record something, put it up for everyone to see those clips. For example, at the moment, we're seeing the running backs who have been out injured with knee injuries and how their training process is going. That wasn't happening back then. So you were going off what you see in some of those preseason games more so. And I think now there's just so much more information. So you would have all the college clips. There wasn't as much of that being shared back in the day as well. But he was somebody who went in round 2. And although running backs, even at that time, were getting drafted later and later, he was somebody who a number of teams were looking for. Obviously, at the time, we knew that there was interest from other teams, but it came out after with some of the footage that was shared, from different draft stories and that the Cardinals really, really wanted to get Amir Abdullah a couple of picks later. He goes to the Lions. They end up drafting David Johnson a couple of picks after that. David Johnson also came into the NFL in pretty exciting fashion in those early games with different returns for touchdowns from open play and so on. So when you look then, I think he's the one that a lot of people would have jumped in on Amir Abdullah and the profile that he has. Abdullah has always been interesting. Even this past year, I was tempted into drafting some Amir Abdullah, and I did draft Amir Abdullah, and that is in the year of 2022. So there is the profile there that's interesting, and coming out as a rookie, I do think, there was obviously positive buzz as well based on not only the highlights, but the draft position that he went as well.
The Joik Bell and Theo Riddick would go into cap that perceived ceiling a little bit. But summer of 2015 is known by leading historians as MFL Summer. Best ball exploded with MFL 10s. Fun looking at that year and shifting perceptions through MFL 10 ADP versus MFL 10 midseason draft ADP. So this is when we get into the Eric Ebron era. Starts at ADP 148, and by mid-October, he shot up to 84. Ebron snatches the first touchdown, and part of the reason is he rose his target displacement from Megatron and the downfield passing game in Jim Bob Cooter's offense, who had taken over for Joe Lombardi in October to prioritize getting the ball out quicker and shorter. Megatron's ADP drops from 13th overall to 48th in midseason drafts and on. Megatron connects with Stafford on a jump ball in the end zone, though, makes it 17-0 Lions in the first quarter. As a Packers fan heading into this game, were you like, what's going on over in Detroit, reeling in Stafford from some of his strengths were you like love to see it, or were you more worried about this new direction presented at the time?
I think when we look, in hindsight and at the time, Stafford has all the ability in terms of making all the throws, and there's obviously concerns now as he ages that maybe that isn't still the case. But I do think there was that little bit of, I guess, to go to a Packers side of things, Brett Favre in terms of could make all the throws, but didn't necessarily need to stay in structure. And sometimes that led to interceptions. He was never really afraid to turn the ball over. He had in my opinion, the best wide receiver. I was going to say of all time, I definitely think in the top three, in terms of, you could throw it down to Calvin Johnson pretty much any time, and you knew he was down there somewhere, and it was pretty much a strong chance he was going to take it down. One of my favorite Calvin Johnson plays of all time, and I'm sure people will recognize it. I believe it's the Cincinnati Bengals, the kind of 3-on-1 catch in the end zone, and I pretty much, so there's a lot of highlight plays, obviously, Calvin Johnson, but yeah, I think it was more a case of, try to limit the turnovers, keep the ball, maybe not put up as many points, but also be able to control the offense a little bit more, to be a little bit more structured. And again, when we're talking about the Packers, that might be something that we see in 2023 potentially with Jordan Love being in there now that Aaron Rodgers isn't there. Is it more structured? Is it more what the coach calls? They're the things that are going to be interesting. But I remember at the start of that season, a lot of praise for the Lions and how they were, although they were not winning every game, there was, potential in the offense. Calvin Johnson as well, when we get to this point, looking back, we didn't really know it fully at the time, but this is, pretty much the end of the road here for Calvin Johnson and his career. And the stuff that's come out since the career has ended and how banged up he was, how much pain he played through, like it was pretty much a miracle that he is even on the field at this point.
He ended up with only 44 yards and 8 targets in this game.
He had 150 targets this season, 88 receptions. So when we talked about trying to limit the turnovers and errors from Stafford, but the connection just in terms of percentage of receptions had died down quite a bit here for him. And just looking at his career stats, amazing. In 2012, 122 receptions, but almost the 2,000 yards that season. That was on 205 targets.
Ooh.
In 16 games.
And yeah, his efficiency went down a lot this season. There's actually a couple plays that in the past seemed like they could have been walk-in touchdowns for Megatron in this game. He and Stafford unable to connect on a couple long throws where he's behind the defense. More shocking to you that the Lions never won a playoff game during the Megatron years, or that they only won 22% of their games against the Packers?
Oh, I'm going to pair both of those together. The problem they ran into is they were in the division with the Packers, and the Packers, were consistently getting to the playoffs. Obviously, we've expanded the playoffs now in the NFL, but really, unless you were the division champion again, it was a situation where you had to be a wild card, and they weren't obviously really in a situation most years for either of them. They had a game against and I believe Megatron was still playing at this time. They did play the Cowboys, and actually, I think now pairing this up in my head as we're talking, I believe that's what led to the Did Dez Catch It game. In Lambeau. I think the Cowboys, if I'm remembering correctly, really scraped that out late on against the Lions in that playoff game in Dallas. I could be completely wrong on that, but I feel, and that could have been the one that got away for them. But there was obviously, like I was saying with the Packers and Aaron Rodgers covering up a lot of cracks, I think this team would have been drastically bad, and it was pretty bad, but imagine what it would have been without Matthew Stafford and Calvin Johnson for that portion of time. It would have been definitely even worse.
Oh yeah, very painful 2-year stretch for the Lions there. They lose on that big flag that gets picked up late that really swings the game there to the Cowboys in the wild card. So here the following year, Lions trying to get back, finally get that first playoff win since 91. What is now the league's longest playoff win drought, and Packers are standing in their way, but Lions are up 20-0. Lions end the season 7-9, Packers end at 10-6, but if things go differently here, it could have been Lions 8-9, Packers 9-8 with the tiebreaker, and who knows, maybe Lions come out a little less flat the following week after this and win instead of lose. Then you have a potential for Lions getting in on tiebreaker to get another shot at their first playoff win.
Yeah, and this was a case where going into this, you mentioned the kind of Packers record and how the season has started, but the Packers go to 8-4 after this, the Lions go to 4-8. So you could have, a 5-7 team, a 7-5 team, much, much closer, as you mentioned. And when we get to how the game ended, there's, full understanding why the Lions come out flat the following week.
Packers pass offense is struggling too, averaging 218 pass yards over this 5-game stretch. Yeah, shutout entering halftime. They end up going down 20-0 in the third quarter. But where are you at this point? How much are you tilting? Are you wondering when's Jordy coming back? If there's other people that can backfill his production collectively, where are you at right now, down 20-0?
I think the season's over. I think that's probably where I was at that point. I think, probably very angry, probably very disappointed. When seasons start off, as fans, we get drawn in, and we've had those couple of seasons, and you feel like we can right the wrong that we slipped up in those other playoffs that we mentioned at the start, and start off 6-0. You're thinking this is the year, and then really starts to fall off. You mentioned the struggles passing. You mentioned no Jordy Nelson. Devontae Adams is struggling at this point in the second season, and I think just it's all falling apart. It's over. The other thing to remember too, and I just want to add this in, is like Rodgers now has moved to the Jets, obviously. But if you think even back to this, up onto Tom Brady has done what he did and played for as long as he did. You're looking at those like the years in your late 30s or where like it's over, and you're looking at championship windows, and you're not going to keep getting those opportunities every single season. And it feels like that window at this point, if they don't win this season, we know we continue to play on. But based on historical trends, it felt like we were really starting to get to the end of the Rodgers situation here.
We're driven by the search for better. But when it comes to hiring, the best way to search for a candidate isn't to search at all. Don't search, match with Indeed. Indeed is your matching and hiring platform with over 350 million global monthly visitors, according to Indeed data, and a matching engine that helps you find quality candidates fast. Leveraging over 140 million qualifications and preferences every day, Indeed's matching engine is constantly learning from your preferences. Join more than 3.5 million businesses worldwide that use Indeed to hire great talent fast. And listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/Blue Wire. Just go to Indeed.com/Blue Wire right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Indeed.com/Blue Wire. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed.
At the UPS Store, we know things can get busy this upcoming holiday. You can count on us to be open and ready to help with any packing and shipping or anything else you might need.
Is there anything you can't do?
Actually, I don't have a good singing voice. The UPS... Nope. But our certified packing experts can pack and ship just about anything.
At least that's good.
Your local, the everything you need to be unstoppable store. The UPS Store. Be unstoppable. The UPS Store locations are independently owned. Product, services, pricing, and hours may vary. See Center for details.
It seemed like without Jordy, Randall Cobb was the only target Rodgers trusted for the most part. And looking at RotoViz tools, including the NFL Player Stat Explorer, even as his binky Cobb only finished as a wide receiver 1 in 2 games in 2015, none over the second half of the year, with just one wide receiver 2 weekly finish over that stretch. Really a trying season overall for Aaron Rodgers, and per the RotoViz screener, had a passing fantasy points over expectation that was 5 times lower than the year prior. You can also track the rise and fall of Eddie Lacy there. What was your relationship like with the Eddie Lacy experience, and how much exposure did you have in 2015, if you recall?
Obviously, when Eddie came into the league, that was 2013. He's drafted in the second round. And, if you think back to the Zero RB article, Sean Siegel comes out in 2013, like people were still very, very heavy on the running back. I know people are still loving the running backs, but heavy on running backs back in the day. So a lot of people, including myself, would have been very much interested in drafting Eddie Lacy, a second round running back at that point. I believe he was the second running back off the board in that draft. And then this is a couple of seasons later, but when he comes in, and it was never, the most graceful with Eddie Lacy. It was, pretty much a bowling ball running downhill and, bouncing off people, spinning. I haven't seen as many running. Maybe it was just more obvious with Eddie Lacy because it seemed like there was more of a body to him when he did his spin, but spinning out of tackles. But we go into 2013, his rookie season, plays 15 games, over 1,000 yards. Heads into 2014, over 1,000 yards again, 11 touchdowns as a rookie, 9 touchdowns in the second season. That is on the ground only. And we're looking then at 20 touchdowns on the ground in the first 2 seasons. Has no rushing or receiving touchdowns in year 1, but does have 35 receptions, has 42 receptions in 2014 for 4 touchdowns. So Eddie Lacy's off to a pretty good start here in an offense that is like having issues at this point, but is consistently, productive. But it really falls off for him in 2015. 758 yards, 3 touchdowns on the ground, 2 in the air. So production too at the on the receiving side falls off with James Starks back. 42 receptions in 2014, drops down to 20 at that point, and then it really just 2016 falls away altogether. Is injured, but 71 carries, 360 yards, no touchdowns through the air, just the 4 receptions, plays 5 games. So then he's off to the Seahawks and then he's done in the NFL. So it really was a kind of, I guess, saying I don't know if it's common in the US as well, but a flash in the pan. But it was like not a 15 minutes of fame. It was like a 2.5 seasons of fame for Eddie Lacy. But it was fun while it was going on, because the problem the Packers had for a long time was they didn't have that kind of 3-down or bell cow running back, and he was somebody who came in a different mold to that offense.
That spin move was perfect for Lambeau in the winter. If you squint, you can almost see like the steam come off it.
Trying to tackle him in the cold, it's not. I don't think that's going to be a fun situation.
Fun era there, though. Here in the Dome, outgained by Starks and a John Crockett. Though gaining isn't much since Lacy only had 1 yard on 6 touches here on Thursday night. He had apparently broken curfew the night before, was being punished in some.
There was some, and I never liked to make jokes about diets and things like that, but there was definitely off the field distractions for Eddie Lacy that caused an end of his time in Green Bay. And I think around this time was where it started to really derail for him.
Yeah, the Eddie Lacy training camp picks were always of great intrigue.
Yeah, the Packers they cycle the bikes to training camp, and there was always a lot of discussion around Eddie Lacy's picks.
And early on, he defied the I guess negative press on that. Did really well. Here in 2015 was sort of the beginning of the end. From a fantasy football lens, 2015 presented a seismic shift with the Packers and for the league. Lacy was going 3rd overall. The MFL drafts, injury-plagued season as well. By mid-October, he had fallen to ADP 36. Le'Veon Bell went 1st, and Jamal Charles went 4th, both out with season-ending injuries. Before this point here, week 13, Adrian Peterson went 5th, which was fine that year, but not what you wanted during the fantasy playoff weeks. Underdog was around back then. I'd be curious after that season to see how Peterson fared in the RotoViz Underdog Advanced Rate Explorer. All tools you can use when evaluating the fantasy landscape going forward, dear listener. Also, this is the second off season after, as you mentioned, Siegel's anti-fragility article. I heard you on a pod the other day talk about how the conventional wisdom can over-index on a particular position in the first round. That's something that can swing between positions over the years. Do you recall the top of this 2015 season's draft at the running back position, if not generally the drafts of the mid-2010s, as having an impact on your fantasy football philosophy?
I think obviously it was much more running back heavy at that time. I think, if you come out of a draft in this range, and yeah, probably still in 2015 and beyond, with 2 wide receivers in the opening 2 rounds, like there was a lot of questions about if you knew what you were doing when you were drafting a fantasy team. So there was always like kind of, I wouldn't say a stigma, but people thought that they were right by going heavy at running back. Running backs were so important. Obviously, running backs in this point too, like even Eddie Lacy, who was having some issues, may not have been the most athletic. There was a lot more bell cows. You mentioned Adrian Peterson, but by the time Adrian Peterson retired, he was almost like one of the last of a breed. And even Peterson himself was somebody who didn't catch passes. And with the explosion of PPR, for example, that became such an important part. That also helped, obviously, the wide receiver position. But I do think it was much more a case of people liking to get those running backs, and starting with 3 running backs in a draft was not something that was overly unexpected. The other thing was that fantasy in general has changed a lot, where more leagues have added more flex positions, to their formats. And in that case, if it was a 2 running back, 2 wide receiver, tight end, and a quarterback league, the need to obviously have those wide receivers in the first and second round wasn't important. It kind of boosted having 2 stud running backs.
Maybe a surprise to some at this point that he'd be easy number 1 in a few years there. Devontae Adams at receiver, as receivers start to move into the first round there in fantasy. Packers claw back. Starks fumbles into the end zone, and Cobb clutching so many ways beats the line to the ball in the end zone. Julius Peppers strip sack on Stafford, and then sophomore Devontae Adams, who is only $4,600 on DraftKings, to give you a snapshot that time. That's the same price as latter-day James Jones. He scores on sort of a sluggo in the red zone. Won't be the first time he and Rodgers connect on that. When did you start to buy in on Devontae Adams?
At the end, and again, we did actually touch on it, that game where did Dez catch it. That game was a playoff game in Lambeau, and that was one where we seen him step out as a rookie and have some plays in a playoff game. And I think that was the first time that I, was really thinking as a fan rather than from a fantasy aspect, this guy could develop into a wide receiver. But then we come out this next season as a sophomore, and he really is struggling at that particular point. So as a rookie, as the 38 receptions, 3 touchdowns, but in his second year, including this, plays 3 less games, has 12 more receptions, 50 receptions, but he finishes with pretty much the same amount of yards, but just the 1 touchdown in that time. There was a lot of people, like I remember playing in dynasty leagues where Devontae Adams was pretty much a throw-in or cut in leagues. And I again, if we think back to then, there was we talk a lot about second-year breakouts now. Well, this was somebody who didn't have a second-year breakout. It was a second-year slump that he had. But when we look then at how players used to, we used to have a 3-year window for a rookie to when they may break out. There was a lot of third-year breakouts at that point. And that is really what Adams done. He came in in his third year, the year after this, and was almost at 1,000 yards, but he had a stretch then the next 3 seasons. So he has 3 touchdowns and 1 touchdown. So you can see why people are concerned about that end of production. He has pretty much the same amount of yards in 2016 as he has in his first 2 seasons, almost 1,000 yards, just 3 yards short. But he has 12 touchdowns, 10 touchdowns, 13 touchdowns. So 35 touchdowns over those next 3 seasons. So it was really an explosion. And we know that continued. The only season that he hasn't hit double digits was a 12-game season in 2019 for him. So definitely didn't see it going to where it went and where it has gone now, to where Devontae Adams, in my opinion, is a first ballot Hall of Famer. And I do think in terms of what he has done, I think he's changed the game. We look at what Justin Jefferson does now in terms of his route running and things like that. I think those guys are, doing what they're doing now based on what Devontae Adams was doing, not in his first and second year, but from then on in terms of route running and what he's able to do. I have a Devontae Adams signed jersey on my wall over on this side, and even though he's no longer a Packer, he's still one of my favorite players of all time.
Nelson would come back the next season, and him and Devontae Adams together would revive Packers offense. Devontae Adams walked in year 1 and 2, so Justin Jefferson could run.
And they also always, the talk is always with the Packers. You mentioned about drafting and not doing free agency, but the conversation has always been that the Packers didn't give Rodgers enough talent. No wide receivers in the first round, basically. But he was another second round pick. We have a lot of incredibly talented second round picks that have come through Green Bay. So, another one for Ted Thompson, who has passed away since this, but was a great general manager.
Yeah, you get Devontae Adams and Jordy Nelson in the second round. You're doing something right.
And speaking of this specific team, second rounder Randall Cobb as well, although was on the downside here. Just amazing what they did through the wide receivers at that point.
So they have just enough there. Devontae Adams makes it 20-14. It's 2014 going in the fourth quarter, so the comeback isn't so wild in its total scale, but there's just a couple moments in the fourth quarter where it seems like it's done, but it isn't quite, because tight end Richard Rodgers, Packers down 9, 23-14. When Lions get into field goal range, Golden Tate, who actually had the more catches than Kelvin Johnson over this early Jim Bob Cooter stretch. He gets them in the field goal range, big 4th-and-2 conversion. 2-score game now, 23-14. Rodgers has 7 minutes, though. Richard Rodgers makes some big catches well before what we'll see at the end. 8 on 8 targets for 146 and a touchdown. 3,100 on DraftKings. You could get 10x from the tight end position. Were you surprised when the Packers went and got Jared Cook the following offseason? And on this Thursday night, were you bullish on the Rodgers to Rodgers connection being one to go through the years?
And funny enough, I know the game was Thursday Night Football. The interesting part is this was, as I mentioned, Friday for me because of the time difference in Australia. So Richard Rodgers, wasn't really a surprise. It was drafted in the 3rd round in 2014, so quite a bit of capital invested in him, but I didn't really ever feel like it was going to be, going to be the superstar tight end, but had a solid career, still playing a little bit in the league, was with the Chargers for a brief time last season. So I wasn't surprised Jared Cook hadn't really had a ceiling at that point, and there was still the potential. And again, if we look at some playoff games, we mentioned the Cowboys earlier, people remember another game with a crazy end and a Mason Crosby field goal set up by a Jared Cook sideline toe tap and grab down in Dallas. So he had his moments as well, but definitely the high point here for Richard Rodgers, and somebody who was I really enjoyed having him as a Packer, but wasn't, again, one of the primary targets when we look at who we were hoping to have making the impact in the likes of Cobb, Adams, or Nelson, even though Nelson was out at this point. But this game for him was crazy. So I don't know if we're at the point where we get to the real finale, but I'll let you take it away, and you can give it the color commentary as we move into it.
Just about there. Richard Rodgers, 2 big completions to get on the scoring drive that makes it 23-21. Rodgers runs it in. Lions get it back. Stafford hits a big 3rd down to Jones, not Marvin. He wasn't there yet. TJ Jones. This means Detroit can run the clock down to about 30 seconds. Packers get it back. They end up, things transpire to where they only have 1 play left at their own 21. A bunch of laterals to see what happens. Richard Rodgers is familiar with this, his father having been involved in the Stanford Cal back in the day. Rodgers gets the ball back, thrown to the ground, but wait, a face mask. One that's kind of tough to blame the defensive lineman for, but that's tough. 15-yard penalty. Packers are in range for Aaron Rodgers there. Colm, can you even watch at this point, or are you standing on your couch? What's the move for you here?
I'm sitting at the edge of a bed. I watched it. I mentioned the sliding door, pretty much a sliding door with basically a glass wall, I guess, paper thin. You can see through to the far side, basically. I'm sitting on a bed with the laptop kind of biting my nails, hoping that something happens. But you've been in this situation before where, game's over, the play, oh, there's a flag, maybe something happens here. But how many times, like, we see on-time downs at the end of the games, but how many times does that lead to something? And how many times does that lead to something if the ball isn't, let's say, inside the 10-yard line? So even with that, we're in a situation where we're at the Green Bay 39 after the 15-yard penalty. So we have the 3rd and 10, as you mentioned, at the 21. As that play goes, it's complete for 19 yards. The lateral that you mentioned goes to Rodgers, goes for minus 16 yards. So then it's a 15-yard penalty from there that puts it at the Green Bay 39 on an untimed down. So there's like all this being sorted out. You've already thought the game's over, obviously multiple times, but looking back at this, what I went in to check was the play-by-play, and it's 1st and 10 with 2 minutes and 11 seconds left with the Lions at the Detroit 47. They run the ball for no gain, gets it to the 2-minute warning. They run it again for minus 2 yards. They run it again on 3rd and 12 for minus 1 yard. Again, I do think, with analytics now, I'm pretty sure that they're going to try and get a 1st down there and the game's over. Like, bad management, I think, but they get it to 29 seconds. And again, 29 seconds, the Packers get it back at the Green Bay 21. They're still probably thinking that, the game's okay at that point. But when it gets to that Rodgers Hail Mary attempt, there's obviously now we have Patrick Mahomes, for example, in the league. We have Josh Allen. But at that point in 2015, I don't think there is many quarterbacks who are getting the ball that distance. And the one thing I always remember about this, you mentioned it being in the dome. when he throws this ball and it goes as high as it does, every time I see the replay of it, I'm expecting it to like hit the screen, hit a wire. I'm expecting it not to, be able to travel because it is thrown at such a trajectory. But again, and we'll touch briefly, I'm sure, before we finish on the other Hail Mary, but the kind of spin away for Rodgers to set up to throw those Hail Marys kind of became a little bit of a routine play for the Packers at points from this point forward. But again, as that ball's in the air, it's kind of a case you see the players waiting to be able to catch the ball. The defenders are ready to compete with the offensive players. You kind of almost see like Richard Rodgers at the very last second almost kind of back his way into the end zone. He's in front of the pile. He catches it and looks like one of the more routine catches that you could actually make. So absolutely. And then the thing that I always remembered is at that point, I obviously I'm wondering, is there any other flags? But I shout, and I mentioned my wife isn't a sports fan. And I go in, she's like, what happened? Like, she doesn't know what's going to happen at that point because I've been so quiet about the game. And then it's kind of, I think I got in a bit of trouble for shouting as loud as I did. And then I was like, this here play, it's amazing. And then she couldn't have cared less while I showed her the replay. So there was all those kind of things to go into it. But it's one of those things that when that happens, that kind of instant reaction, like you can't plan that if they get a Hail Mary play to win the game, how you're going to react. But I just remember like the chaos of the celebration, the players running everywhere. And there is always something a little bit special about playing at a rival stadium and, getting that walk-off score, to really sink a dagger in. So, yeah, it again came from, if we're looking at potential win probabilities, at halftime and at 20-0, I'm sure this here one was heavily stacked in the favor of the Lions. And come back even at that very late point, I would imagine it's pretty much in the high 90s again for the Lions to walk away with it. So just an absolutely spectacular finish to a game.
Jim Caldwell doesn't have Megatron out there because Packers had just run a lateral play. So Lions are seemingly ready for the lateral play there potentially. They end up with the opposite problem of when the Patriots had Gronk out there in Miami 3 years later. So they win here 27-23 on their way, another playoff berth. They make it to the divisional round. We see that again. Aaron Rodgers to Jeff Janis as he and Jared Abbrederis combined for like 200 yards that game. I think about 150 were Janis. Probably should have had one in this Lions game. A dime dropped in by Rodgers earlier. They don't come up with it. His combine measurables have spawned some ones in the RotoViz archives, such as Jeff Janis and NFL Draft Love Story, and later on, Don't Hate Jeff Janis, Hate Me. Colm, as a Packers fan, were you also a Janis stan?
Oh, yes. Fond memories of both Jeff Janis and hoping he would become a thing, and also the yearly conversations around like, why is Jeff Janis not getting 100 targets from Aaron Rodgers? Like, why is this not happening? Let's get rid of Jordy Nelson. Just give Jeff Janis the ball. So it went on, and it never really happened. But I think the closest it ever came, and the one that will always sit in my memory, is that game that you mentioned. They go into the playoffs, they lose in heartbreaking. There's a theme here for the playoffs, isn't there? They lose in heartbreaking fashion. They're on a run here where between the Seahawks and the NFC Championship game, the games versus the 49ers, and then they lose here to the Cardinals in Arizona to Larry Fitzgerald with, first play of overtime. I believe he went 75 yards. They finish it off shortly after that. He's tackled at the 5-yard line. He runs through everybody. But before that, the Packers are in Hail Mary mode, I guess we say again. They're down. They finish that game 20-20, and the reason they do so is thanks to Jeff Janis catching Hail Mary once again, 41-yard touchdown. I still think we can call that a Hail Mary based on how it played out. That was not an easy catch. That was one that they were like kind of wrestling on the ground. Really, really, fun play, spectacular play again, one that I was hoping. And the theme as well was overtimes where Aaron Rodgers didn't get the ball first. We've seen multiple times where the Packers got knocked out in overtime where he wasn't getting the ball. But prior to that Hail Mary, in this particular game, he goes for 7 of 11 targets, 7 receptions, 145 yards, and 2 touchdowns in this game. The other part, though, is that he goes, there's a deep pass to Jeff Janis, which led to a penalty on that drive. There's a 4th and 20 at the Green Bay 4-yard line that goes to Jeff Janis for 60 yards. That is with 55 seconds left in that game. And then the Hail Mary takes place with no seconds left. It is caught. So on that final drive, he caught 101 yards because there was also a penalty on that drive and a touchdown on 2 receptions. So one of I think that might be one of the best wide receiver drives of all time by Jeff Janis.
Comparing these two games, the Lions Hail Mary game and the Cardinals one.
To be honest, both of the one was that we won the game, and one was that it was a tie, and you knew it was going to overtime. And obviously, you need to know then: are you getting the ball? Can you score? Do you win? Do you lose? The thing with the Lions game was it was the final play, and it put you in the lead. So even on that Hail Mary to Jeff Janis in the playoffs, Mason Crosby had to score the extra point. So as excited as you were, there's also that bit of doubt in your mind, oh, what if we missed the extra point? And there wasn't as many missed extra points back at that point before the rules changed up. But I think that's the only reason that the Arizona game isn't above the Detroit one, is because one was a win, one ended up being a loss. So obviously that's a major factor into how all that played out.
This has been another episode of Remember That Game. Please rate, review, subscribe, and check out more episodes.